Meher Spiritual Center, a place of pilgrimage for all time. Origins and development. For 75 years now, the Meher Spiritual Center has sat, nestled in a once secluded wooded area along Highway 17 in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Throughout those years, the progress of the modern world has continued all around it, and the area has developed in ways that Simeon B. Chapin might only have dreamed of when he first arrived in Myrtle Beach over a century ago. Here to this place, where once Meher Baba's devotees shouted his name into the dense virgin forest, now thousands come each year, seeking rest, rejuvenation, and renewal of the spiritual life. When Meher Baba visited here first in 1952, and later on 2 subsequent visits, he called the Meher Spiritual Center his home in the West. Not so long ago, at Mirazad, India, Meher Baba's home in the East, Meher Baba's much-beloved disciple, Erich Jasawala, used to ask recently arrived and weary pilgrims, "So, tell me, how did you come to be with us in this place today?" Those driving down Highway 17 in Myrtle Beach, if they notice at all the small, unobtrusive sign reading Meher Spiritual Center, founded 1944, might well ask themselves, how did a spiritual center come to be in this place? The answer, of course, is simple. The Meher Spiritual Center is here because Meher Baba asked his disciples to create it. That is to say, the Meher Spiritual Center is here because of love and because of discipleship. Although Meher Baba observed complete silence from July 10, 1925, until his passing in January 1969, he continued to communicate effortlessly through various means. In an interview in November 1931, shortly after his initial arrival in the United States, he communicated through his alphabet board. Love is the only real religion. People are now fed up with dogma, doctrines, and principles. They want something real, which explanations can never give. They must feel truth, see truth, and experience truth. Only then can one feel oneself in harmony with everything and everyone. There is no religion higher than love. Love is the only way leading to truth and God realization. Mind and intellect provide only superficial understanding. It is dry knowledge. One must see God and experience Him. That is real. Then union can be experienced. It takes a long time. It is a long way off. The shortest, quickest way to the realization of truth is through love. And so it was for Elizabeth Patterson and Norina Matchabelli, co-founders of the Meher Spiritual Center. They both, upon first meeting Meher Baba in 1931, established loving relationships with him. Elizabeth Patterson describes one of her first meetings with Meher Baba soon after his arrival. Motioning for us to be seated beside him, he desired that we meditate together a few minutes. Instead of going into abstraction, I was aware of tears pouring unexpectedly down my face, tears which seemed to me meaningless at the time, as I felt neither joy nor sorrow. I only hoped I could control them, before the others opened their eyes, but was not in the slightest degree aware of the depths within me which Baba was thawing. While I instantly recognized him upon meeting, still I was spiritually slumbering and did not even guess the effect of this encounter upon my life or the awakening change in the recesses of my being. Norina Matchabelli described a similar experience of transformation upon her initial meeting with Meher Baba. I entered the room in which Baba was sitting, surrounded by followers and disciples. That very moment, an experience began full of wonder and beauty. Suddenly, I had to run across the room, and I found myself weeping on the floor at his feet. Weeping, weeping. Oh, how I was weeping. But I also began to laugh, and the streams running down my cheeks and the outbursts of laughter became one. I was resting my head on Baba's hand, and my whole body was shaking with terrific sobs of liberation. For both women, very quickly, love was transformed into discipleship. Through correspondence, as well as through Meher Baba's subsequent trips to the U.S. and Norina and Elizabeth's trips to Europe and India, their relationship with Meher Baba and the depth of their commitment to him grew ever deeper. Two other disciples who were instrumental in the development of the Meher Spiritual Center came to know of Meher Baba in 1932 and met him in 1934. They were Darwin and Jean Shaw. Unlike Norina and Elizabeth, Darwin knew about Meher Baba and was devoted to him for several years before meeting him in person. Of their first meeting, Darwin said, "I was overjoyed. Baba's beauty, the sweetness of his love, which could not be expressed in words, the joy, the sparkling wonder of his being. One could not prefigure him. One could not imagine how it would be, what he would be like. He was more than one could imagine, much more, immeasurably more." John Bass, who met Meher Baba in 1932, was another disciple who later became instrumental in the development of the Meher Center. As the years progressed, others joined in the work as well. But however different their personalities, each one shared the experience of a deep bond of affection for Meher Baba and a commitment to follow him as best they could. Elizabeth and Norina's commitment to Meher Baba led to an extended stay with him in India. There, along with a small group of other Western disciples, they traveled, lived, worked, and learned about discipleship in an Indian ashram environment, along with Meher Baba's Eastern devotees. They learned more about Meher Baba's life and his ways of working, and they learned about discipline, but most of all, they learned about love. One of Elizabeth's roles in India was as managing editor of a new publication, the Meher Baba Journal. At her request, Meher Baba contributed one article to each issue. The June 1940 issue of the journal begins with a discourse by Meher Baba entitled True Discipleship, in which he says, "The love which constitutes the core of discipleship stands by itself among the different types of love which obtain in ordinary social relations. Mundane love is an interplay between two centers of God unconscious. But the love implied in discipleship is the love of God unconscious for God conscious. The service which the disciple can offer to the Master is not only linked up with the universal cause of humanity, but is one of the most potent means of bringing the disciple nearer to his spiritual goal. When the service offered by the disciple is spontaneous, wholehearted, selfless, and unconditional, it brings him more spiritual benefit than can ever come by any other means. It was in this spirit of discipleship that Elizabeth and Norina and the other inmates of the ashram worked for Meher Baba. In the spring of 1941, when they had been there for more than 4 years, he asked them to return to the United States and locate a suitable place for him to have a spiritual center. It was in this same spirit of discipleship, with little money and no idea where to start, that Elizabeth and Norina accepted the challenge and set off into unknown territory. The idea of a permanent center for Meher Baba in America was not a new one. The idea had been discussed and actively pursued as early as Meher Baba's first visit to the U.S. in November of 1931. On that trip, a devotee named Kath Gardner, who owned a house and land near Greenfield, New Hampshire, put them in Meher Baba's name. Baba visited the property later that month while visiting nearby Boston, Massachusetts, but he never stayed there, and in the end returned it to her. In 1935, Darwin Shaw wrote to Baba, "Dear Baba, as one who loves you, I take the liberty to write to you. There are several of us here who are very much interested in starting a spiritual retreat out in the country. We have no definite plans and very little money, but we trust God to work out the details if it is His will for us." Baba replied, "My dear Darwin, I have your very loving letters and poems, and do so much appreciate your spirit of love, devotion, and service. I know how you and your dear wife feel, and I have always been helping you spiritually, as you already experienced. I am glad to know about the loving ones of the group that you have formed and who wish to start a retreat if plans succeed. Whether that retreat on earth is established or not, I do really appreciate the spirit of brotherhood and love that has been awakened, and consider it as a spiritual retreat already established within, which is much more substantial and real than any earthly home or structure built for the purpose. And don't worry, my dear Darwin, for being unable to come to me and meet me for want of material means. Those who are united in love are always in spirit and know no separation. Give my love and blessings to your dear wife, Jean, and remember, I am always with you. Give my love and blessings to all the dear ones who seek and need, and who are in the group. All my love to you, M.S. Irani." Later in India, Elizabeth and Norina were involved in activities directed at establishing a universal spiritual center in the cities of Mandla and Biramangala. Norina and others gave talks heralding the project, and architect drew up plans for a sprawling campus with several buildings, and Baba broke ground in Biramangala in 1939. However, by the time Elizabeth and Norina left India in 1941, neither of these projects had come to fruition. Meher Baba must have known that Elizabeth Patterson was the ideal person to find and establish his center. Although she had been born into a wealthy family, Elizabeth was a hard-working, independent woman at a time when women were not typically involved in business. She once remarked, "I didn't have to work, but I wanted to. The reason I went into a job when other women weren't doing it was because I wanted to travel, and I wanted to be able to say that I did earn the money for that purpose, and no one could say I didn't. Work gave me independence." Elizabeth volunteered for the American Red Cross during World War I, where she drove an ambulance. After the war, she returned to New York, where she ran a successful insurance business. Before meeting Meher Baba, she had already traveled all over the world, including Sweden, Russia, Persia, Iraq, and Turkey. She seemed well prepared and ideally suited for the challenge of locating the best spot in the United States for a retreat center for Meher Baba. Elizabeth described the search in a talk given at the Meher Center in August 1970.
Baba had said to look for a place with certain qualifications, and it had to have equable climate. In those days, California was told that everybody would live longer and children would be better and the air was perfect and there was very little rain and it was just ideal, a little different than they're telling now, but in any case, so we first thought of California as a place to go. Then it had to be ample water, virgin land, good soil, and given from the heart. Well, the heart part, as we didn't have any money, we know it could only be given from the heart. So that worried us the least. And then we went to San Francisco. And Norina, every place, she was to give a talk for Baba as well as to look for the center, you see. And I'm mentioning this because these things have all come up recently. And I was asked, where was it that we stayed that summer? Didn't Rabia Martin, who was the Sufi Murshid at that time, hear about Baba when we were staying there? And I wrote back and I said, no, it's more interesting than that Norina gave a talk about Baba, the first one that was ever given in San Francisco, and it was in the Masonic Hall. It was Rabia Martin heard about Baba and came to speak about him, and later came to New York and so forth. Well, now, when we were out there, we looked, and Rabia had told us that there was some wonderful land, that while San Francisco really did get cold in the winter, this Marine County had the Japanese current. And it was mild. It was always mild and beautiful, this wonderful Japanese current that came there. And we certainly must look. So we looked. And we had an open car, and that particular day, August, which is hot, it got colder and colder and colder until poor Rabia's teeth chattered. And never once did she ever say, again, we saw the center there, but we never once did she mention, nor did we say that it wasn't the place, because it was very obvious. And Baba had a wonderful way of telling us as children, too hot, this is too hot, too cold, and so forth.
After almost 3 years of searching, with no suitable results, Elizabeth went to visit her father, Simeon Chapin, over the Easter holiday of 1943 at his home in Myrtle Beach. Simeon Brooks Chapin was born in 1865 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He had built his fortune in the stock market, with trading offices in Chicago and New York City. It was in New York where he eventually settled and raised his family. In 1912, Mr. Chapin went into partnership with the Burroughs brothers to form the Myrtle Beach Farms Corporation, whose main interest was developing Myrtle Beach into a major resort area. The partnership owned some 65,000 acres of land, which they hoped to develop. This land included the 500 acres that was destined to become the Meher Spiritual Center. However, due to a variety of business concerns, the company decided, rather fortuitously as it turned out, to divest itself of much of its real estate holdings. In early 1926, the company sold over 64,000 acres of land to textile magnate John T. Woodside. This was the Roaring Twenties, and Mr. Woodside promoted and developed his new holdings with enormous enthusiasm. He conceived an ambitious project involving a luxury hotel, the Ocean Forest Hotel, a country club, and projected miles of trails, parkland, golf courses, and gardens, intending to make Myrtle Beach a world-class vacation spot. He even managed to have the only access road, the Old Kings Highway, rerouted around his property, creating what is now Highway 17. Fortune did not favor Mr. Woodside, however, and when the stock market crashed in October of 1929, so did his fortunes. Myrtle Beach Farms, however, had financed the transaction themselves, and the property returned to them when Woodside defaulted on his loan. As a result, Simeon B. Chapin and his partners still held thousands of acres of property when Elizabeth Patterson went to visit her father in April of 1943.
My father had been down here. He had retired from business, of a business that he had been in for 40 years, that he had formed, and he became interested in land at Pinehurst. Then we heard of Myrtle Beach, and he came over here, and we had, he'd always say, well, my children aren't all, there was 4 children, grown up, and they were not interested at all. They never come down here. They never wanted to. Myrtle Beach, of course, was not very intriguing at that time. So he said, if my husband couldn't come down, which it turned out he couldn't, then would I bring a friend? So I mentioned Norina, and I said, of course, I don't think at all it's a place for the center, because as I remember it, there's just land, one division after another. I mean, people buy a lot, and then the next lot, and then the next lot, and of course, nothing was developed up this way at all. But while we were in his house there, something came up about some lakes. Immediately our ears went up, and I said, what kind of lakes are they? Oh, they're freshwater lakes. Oh, and they're near the ocean. That sounds, oh, they're not only near the ocean, they're near the waterway. Well, that's 3 kinds of water. So immediately we wanted to come up and see it.
Their curiosity aroused, Elizabeth made arrangements with a local business acquaintance of her father's, James Bryan Sr., to show them the property. Due to unexpected rising tide waters, they had to abandon their first attempt. However, Mr. Bryan's son, James Bryan Jr., took them to see the property on the following day.
He took a shovel with him, and he took planks and everything in case we got stuck. But what he did was to race the car so fast so that it wouldn't get stuck. And of course, it all had overgrown, and you kept seeing these bushes coming from every direction, even on the at you. And finally we arrived, and we couldn't see anything. And he said, "Oh, just wait a minute, just a minute." And he took out a bush axe, and he cleared a place in no time, and we landed exactly where the parking place is now. And we just knew it was a place. We could see the beauty of it, we could see the ocean beyond, we could feel the peace, and we knew it was just right. Of course, afterwards we were in communication with Barbara. We didn't go ahead. We could write to Barbara. There was not airmail, though, in those days. There was cables. So what we would usually do is to write and then get some answer by cable.
Elizabeth and Norina returned home to New York, and after some deliberation and communication with Baba, Elizabeth decided to return to Myrtle Beach to talk to her father about the property. By this time, Darwin Shaw had been working cooperatively with Elizabeth and Norina on Baba projects for many years. He and John Bass were both especially active with helping Norina when she would give public talks on Meher Baba in New York City. So Elizabeth asked Darwin to accompany her. Darwin described the experience in his book, As Only God Can Love. Elizabeth and I took a train to Wilmington, North Carolina, and if I recall correctly, Mr. Chapin's driver met us at the station. In Myrtle Beach, we stayed at the Patricia Manor, an oceanfront hotel located south of Yupon Dunes, as Elizabeth's parents' house was called. The same day we arrived, Elizabeth and I went to her father's office in downtown Myrtle Beach. He knew about Elizabeth's deep interest in Meher Baba. In fact, both Mr. and Mrs. Chapin had met Baba in the early 1930s and were very favorably impressed with him and his mission. After a few minutes of chatting about family matters, Elizabeth spoke to her father about searching with Norina throughout the country for land for a spiritual center for Baba, and about how they finally realized that some of the property that was owned by the Myrtle Beach Farms Company might be suitable.
We decided that this lake would be quite ideal. So I came back and asked my father, and he said, "No, impossible. That lake, any of those lakes are not for sale." He had become interested in a company, and I asked him why. And he said, "Well, you see, they're considering selling one lot after another, and this would be way up at the end." And jokingly, he said it might be the year 2000, because it wasn't going very fast, the development, when they would be selling up that end. Or, he said, it might be that they would sell all the lakes to one great development. Well, of course, needless to say, after having looked so long and finding what I felt was exactly the thing, Norina felt the same, and I looked very disappointed, and I said, "You know, Father, you say that none of your children are interested in Myrtle Beach." And I said, "How can they be so far away from where they live? And you're only interested because you have an interest here. My interest is finding a center." And my father knew it. We knew it. We'd looked in California and so forth. And I said, "Of course, if you'd rather have us find something far off someplace." Well, he didn't say anything, but the next morning he said, "Well, now," he said, "which lake are you interested in?" And of course, none of the lakes had real names. And I said, I don't know. I only know it's the biggest one. Because that's what they had told me, you see. When I said, it's the biggest lake, he said, oh, that might be possible. And I wondered how it could be possible. And he said, well, you see, that lake is at the far end. And they might snip it off, the way he expressed it. And if it were in the middle, you see, there would still be broken up land. Well, of course, it didn't happen quite that quickly. But in the meantime, we wrote to Baba, and Baba said, try. That's what he usually says when he cables, and he agrees. He said, try your best.
Elizabeth's father, now being convinced of the possibility of obtaining the land for his daughter, the affair hinged on the agreement of his partners. After lengthy discussions and negotiations, the matter was settled, and Mr. Chapin offered the land to Elizabeth.
Now, you see, Father gave it to me from his heart. And it just happened. It had to be at that time because he was in very good health. He was 79 years old, 78 at that time, and 1 year after he passed away. So it was just timed. It had to be then, because no one else could have talked to the partners. No one else could have agreed upon it, and it couldn't have been done. And it would have been probably done the way they'd always anticipated doing it, lot by lot, you see. And then, of course, came the development of it. Now that is a story of many people. The greatest one in regard to it was Norina Matchabelli.
Norina Gili was born in Italy to an Italian-Swiss family whose high-end patisserie, Café Gili, founded 1733, remains a Florence landmark. She had a mystical bent from childhood on, and as a young woman gained acclaim for her performance as the Madonna in the silent film The Miracle. Norina later married Prince Matchabelli of perfume fame and emigrated to New York. After her husband's death in 1935, she shared an apartment with Elizabeth Patterson. Norina's exquisite artistic sense and close intuitive communications with Meher Baba proved crucial to the placement of roads and cabins and the overall artistic design of the Meher Spiritual Center, always emphasizing the center's natural beauty. In addition to Norina, several other people contributed substantially to the early development of the Meher Spiritual Center. Darwin Shaw and his wife Jean of Schenectady, New York, were a young couple deeply interested in the life of the spirit. In 1932, Darwin saw a newspaper article announcing that the Indian spiritual teacher Meher Baba was coming to New York. Although he did not meet Meher Baba in person until 1934, Darwin commuted regularly to New York City, helping Norina with her public talks and cooperating with the work of the New York group whenever and however he could. Darwin and Jean, Darwin's parents, and Darwin's niece all played roles in preparing the center. Frank Eaton made several trips to Myrtle Beach to help develop the center. He eventually moved to Myrtle Beach from Schenectady, where he and Darwin had both worked for the city. A gifted musician who reportedly could play almost any instrument, Frank taught music and played with local bands, but he dedicated most of his life to serving as the center's caretaker. A mentor to generations of later center workers, Frank served as the second person to fill the position of overnight caretaker after Joe Chestnut.
The whole center is based on giving it to Baba with love. All the work has been voluntary, with the exception of the caretaker, which is another matter, of course, because that is a real, I'll say, an 8-hour job that is sometimes 16, and things of that kind. I mean, that's another matter. And even so, it's a matter of devotion. And I might say that with Frank, it's a matter of devotion as well as actually having the job. With Joe, who was our first caretaker for 4.5 years before Frank was there, he would come in. One of the things that Barbara said, there must be somebody sleeping at the center, a caretaker sleeping at the center every night. That is very important.
Another important volunteer was John Bass, a New Yorker whose family originated in Eastern Europe. John met Meher Baba in 1932 through Norina. He facilitated the Monday night meetings in Manhattan for many years, and with Darwin Shaw, was prop manager for Norina's Carnegie Hall talks. A tap-and-dye worker by trade, during his free time, John made several trips to Myrtle Beach to help with work needed to prepare the center. He even donated one of the first cabins, the lake cabin. After one visit to Myrtle Beach, he wrote to Baba about his stay there. Dearest Baba, I returned last month from a week's stay in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The place is undeveloped, not easily accessible, but may have great possibilities. I enjoyed my stay thoroughly, despite the hottest weather and heaviest lightning for many years in that part of the country, and 2 days of forest fires, which came close to our center. The prefabricated cottage which I bought had not arrived in time for me to stay in it. I most humbly thank you for the many blessings I have and hope to receive. Most devotedly yours, John Bass. In 1954, John, Darwin Shaw, and Frank Eaton all attended the 3 Incredible Weeks gathering with Meher Baba in India. Phyllis Frederick and Adele Wolkin were such close friends that Meher Baba gave them the combined nickname of Phil-Adele. Adele met Phyllis in 1943 in New York through a shared interest in philosophy, and through Phyllis she met Norina. Adele lived with Norina and Elizabeth for 4 years, helping to prepare for Meher Baba's expected coming to the West. Both Phyllis and Adele made early trips to Myrtle Beach to help with the development of the Meher Spiritual Center. However, none of these intrepid travelers had any idea what they were in for when they made their way down the East Coast toward Myrtle Beach for their first extended stay on the new property. Meher Baba had asked for land that no one had lived on, and that is what he got. A wild, untrodden wilderness that wreaked havoc upon any who attempted entry. It is true that the old King's Highway, which still runs through the property, had been built on old Indian trails. Native hunter-gatherers had no doubt passed through the area for centuries. As late as the 18th century, there were still 6 active Waccamaw Indian villages along the Waccamaw River in Georgetown and Horry counties, near the area now known as Dog Bluff. However, the combination of swampland and the rugged terrain of the Meher Center property apparently discouraged these tribal peoples from establishing any permanent settlements here. Locals love to talk of how George Washington traveled the old King's Highway on his way to Charleston, and no doubt many colonial people crossed over the land on their way up and down the coast. But there is no evidence that anyone ever settled and lived here. As Elizabeth Patterson has said, many lived near here, but no one seems to have lived on the center property itself.
Traditionally, no one has ever lived here, but they have lived right near here, which is Briarcliff Acres which is now a subdivision, and other places. It was called the Vereen Plantation, and mostly the South was divided into plantations, and it's very rare that there is a place that it was not a plantation. I can't give all the reasons why it wasn't, but it wasn't. And most of you can say, what is the difference? I say that a plantation is usually not only lived in, but overlived. If you go to any plantation, they have a long story of tragedy, and this happened and that happened, and of course they had slaves, we know, but this was a place without, like a clean slate.
At that time, this whole area was just a virgin woodland, all up and down the coastal area. It was completely undeveloped as far as the resort area, except Myrtle Beach, the town. The highway was a simple double-lane highway, and even to get into the center property, it was very difficult, and one was able to get in on an old dirt road. Actually, it's a sandy road, and we even sometimes got stuck in the road getting in and out. The old King's Highway, a highway that goes back, way back into the previous century, at least. At that time, some of us used to come down with Elizabeth or by ourselves and meet here, and we would come on our vacation time, like Frank Eden, myself, Adele McEwen, Phyllis Frederick, John Bass. There were others as well, the early ones, and it was just a real wilderness at that time. And the cabin on the hill was really the first cabin built here. And then little by little, some of the others, like Frank Eden, had a prefab cabin built, brought here and built. And that was what is now the coop. And John Bass had a little cabin, a prefab type brought and put together, which is now the lake house. Of course, it's been enlarged quite a bit since then and made much more beautiful. Then there was the little tool shed, which I slept, which was very comfortable for me. And in those days, we weren't aware of what we were getting into, and it took us a little while to realize that we had to wear high leather boots and cover our arms and use all sorts of repellents, because it took us a while to discover that there were mosquitoes and poison ivy and things like that. And through the years, of course, these things have been controlled. But I know often I would go home after a couple of weeks here and take 2 or 3 more weeks trying to get over some poison ivy or something like that. But it was great fun and a great adventure, because Baba was in back of us, Elizabeth and Norina were constantly writing and cabling back and forth to Baba. And so we were busy with bush axes and eventually there was a truck, and we worked on the roads, bringing in coquina to spread along the roads and make them. But hired help was also available, and little by little, the initial pattern of the center began to emerge. In those early years, we could scarcely imagine what would develop and how much of an attraction it would be in later years. In the early 40s, for example, it was difficult to get wood because of the war at that time. But undaunted, Elizabeth and Norina went out and found places where they could get some prefab cottages. I think they were Army surplus, and they became the near cabin, the far cabin, and the caretaker's cabin, and perhaps some of the others. And little by little, the place began to build up. And it was realized that there should be a large meeting place, because there will probably be quite a few people coming here. And in this time when wood was so scarce, how were they going to get enough wood to make a large meeting place? So, with their usual initiative and intuition, Elizabeth struck out and found a barn. Actually a barn in the village of Conway, some 25 miles away. And this was an old barn, but it was made out of very durable Pecky cypress wood. And I remember we went over and looked it over. And we were saying, well, it looks as though it would be a good building if we could only get it over to the center. How do you get a barn over to the center? So again, what was finally done, the old barn was purchased and taken apart, board by board, and brought over here and reassembled where it now stands. Of course, it didn't have a floor like that in it when it was really a barn, and it had a loft in it when it was a barn, so that it's been sort of remodeled, but essentially it is still the barn, you see. And of course the chimney with the beautiful fireplace and the French doors overlooking the lake were an addition. They weren't, of course, there in the original barn. And it eventually became this place where Baba has seen so many people. A great deal of struggle has gone into the evolution of this center, much more than I perhaps am able to put into a few words. But there were many trips back and forth between New York and Myrtle Beach.
Elizabeth described that first stay in a similar way.
The first time we came, Darwin Shaw and Jean and Frank and John Bass and quite a number came, and we came to stay for 3 weeks, I believe. And we brought in a great deal of food with us because we weren't able to go out for food after we once got in here. We were lucky to have somebody to bring us in. And of course, when you put supplies for 3 weeks, you get too much of one thing and not enough of another. We had no refrigeration, but they said, oh yes, that's fine, you can just put what you have in the water, and we found that the fish came and ate it or whatever it was, and then we put a net around it, a screening, and whatever it wasn't too satisfactory. But what had been built in the meantime was the cabin on the hill. The first cabin was built for Baba. Everything was envisioned from the cabin on the hill, you see, looking down. And bit by bit, each person gave a cabin at that time. And everything was given to the center, and I give this to Baba with love. And there was no question of ownership of anything, right from the beginning. Even if it was a chair, or if it was anything, table, or whatever it was, they all had to write down, I give this to Baba with love.
We were constantly in communication with Baba in regard to the various projects that were going on, what we found, and so forth. And Margaret Krask has only told me the other day that Baba had her, when they were going around India, had her carry plans of the center, or whatever we sent in her suitcase. She had to have them right with her, with Baba during that time. So he was in very close touch in every way with it.
In fact, during that first 3-week stay in June of 1944, Elizabeth wrote a long letter to Baba, detailing all that had transpired and all of her hopes for Baba's center in the future. Throughout the letter, she makes it clear that her only and greatest hope is that Baba will accept the center as his own. She closes by saying, "Kindly tell me that you will make me happy by accepting as soon as you come. In our every thought and deed, it is yours now. With all my love to you and loving remembrances to all, devotedly always, Elizabeth." Interestingly, during the same time period that Elizabeth was working to complete the transfer of the center property, Meher Baba's home in the West, Baba was establishing Meherzad as his home in the East. Throughout her struggles to tame the wilderness that was to become the Meher Spiritual Center, Elizabeth remained in regular contact with her parents, with whom she had always been close. Both of her parents had met Meher Baba in 1932, and her mother, Elizabeth Maddox Chapin, had been instrumental in Meher Baba's 1932 visit to the United States, having loaned the group $5,000 for traveling expenses. Both she and her husband, Simeon Chapin, were known throughout their lifetimes for their generosity and philanthropic works.
The amazing part is that Mother saved my letters, and only recently have I seen the letters, forgotten all about it, but she said, Elizabeth, Myrtle Beach, and she had saved those particular letters.
During that first stay on the center property, while war raged in Europe, Elizabeth wrote to her parents, "Dearest Father and Mother, regarding our life in the forest, it is slowly emerging out of its most primitive state. We invaded nature, and the underbrush would invade us." By the way, the invasion, Eisenhower's June 6th D-Day, took place during our first week here, and we did not know about it until the 10th, which was the first day we came out for mail and news. However, rehearsals go on, even out where we are, because aeroplanes seem to use these lakes as markers when they fly straight out to sea or return. Also, government cutters or destroyers drop depth bombs offshore beyond sight, but not beyond hearing and feeling. We hear a powerful discharge, then a repercussion and earthquake. We are expecting all sorts of things to float on to shore from the past and present ages. A week later, she wrote, "We smelt smoke one day when we went out to the road and reported it to Joe Chestnut, who seemed not to be concerned. On our way back from town, we saw actual flames in a small area. Then we reported it by foot to the Coast Guard, whose phone was out of order. They came and looked at the fire and probably thought they had put it out by chemicals. In short, the fire was put out once by the Coast Guard and 3 times by the Army, and continued for 48 hours until a blessed rain came unexpectedly and finally extinguished it. The fire was undoubtedly started by airplanes dropping something like a flare or a tracer bullet. I understand that the pilots have been instructed by the general since that time, and we have not seen any planes come across the Long Lake, as they did every afternoon previously, after they had fired at the sea range." Meanwhile, further construction continued.
And then after that, there were some other cabins. But when Mayor Baba told us, he was coming over with some of his women, Mandalay. And that they were at that time in
strict seclusion, and that we would have to have a building for them. Well, Norina and I consulted how you could have, if we're going to have a lot of other people, a place in seclusion. So we found out that we had this lovely lagoon, and we built a bridge across it. So we knew that no matter who you were, they knew if they were crossing a bridge, if they might lose themselves in the forest and come out at the guest house, but they couldn't cross a bridge and not know they were crossing it.
A year later, Elizabeth mentioned the guest house project in a letter to her mother. Dear Mother, last night was a good old thunderstorm and I thought of you. Work goes very slowly at the center. The laborers are also farmers, and this is the tobacco season. So one day they come, and 3 days they do not show up. The young returned veteran, who was discharged from the Army and running the dredging machine, went to North Carolina every Sunday to see his girl, and he has not been heard of since, perhaps eloped. Yet something gets done, and every bit is an improvement. The guest cottage is not finished more than you saw it, because every time the green wood for us got seasoned, it was sold to others. Finally, Mr. Moore said he would season it on his place. The Mr. Moore Elizabeth mentions is Truman Moore, a local contractor who was involved with several important buildings on the center. In addition to the guest house, his company oversaw the construction of the barn, the cabin on the hill, Baba's house, Dilruba, and other projects. The war affected the center in many ways. At one point, a team of German prisoners of war worked on many of the roads and paths, including the path along the lake that begins below the original kitchen and ends near the beach. Although Baba liked what he had heard about the cabin on the hill, he told Elizabeth that a larger, more permanent structure should be built for those who would come in the future to see where Baba had lived. A search began for a suitable design for the house.
He sent us a drawing that Anabas's uncle had done, and it was the most enormous building, and they had this man wanted to have the most beautiful thing for Baba. So every room had a dressing room, and then they had a lumber room, and they had all sorts of things. It was a sprawling house. So I showed it to the architect down here, the builder, and he shook his head, and he said, well, he couldn't even give us a price on something like that over here. And it was very interesting. In the paper, the very next Sunday, they were having a showing of a prize for the architect that had won the prize for the year. And it was, what attracted me, it said it was the perfect house. And I looked at the house they called the perfect house, and it was exactly what Baba wanted, without all those superfluous things. And so this was what we had. And of course you sent for a plan of it, sent it to Baba, and Baba said that was just fine and to go ahead. Then he said he wanted to have a 8-foot fence around it. Well, we never questioned what Baba wanted, or why he wanted it, but it was a little bit difficult to build a brick fence, because the contractor said to build a big fence that would stand up way around the house, would cost as much as the house itself, or even more. So also, as we were always looking and listening, we saw in the paper that there was a place in Pennsylvania that had French chestnut. They sell French chestnuts. In other words, in France, nearly all farms have a fence around them. And they had imported some of these chestnut trees to Pennsylvania and had grown them there, and they were selling these fences that could withstand weather and all the rest of it. So immediately we bought sections of it. And when it came, they thought to put it up sort of in a square. And Norina and I looked at each other and thought it would sort of look like the backyard. When you go on a train, you see somebody's backyard, they have a high fence. In other words, not artistic at all. But we ended by the landscape gardener that was helping. He said, oh yes, you could just curve weave the fence in and out of the trees, and then you don't notice any square parts. So you probably don't even know it's woven between the trees, but it is. And of course the chestnut is very much the same as the woods, and so you don't see it, doesn't stand out. Baba had all the plans there, and he said that he wanted the house 500 feet from the middle of the road, which is the subdivision. The subdivision runs parallel with the center, and that we were to measure from the middle of the road in 500 feet, and there he wanted the house. Of course, that was far from where the other buildings were, so it was very difficult in one sense to know exactly what 500 feet, because it was a curving road, it was arched, so we had to get the, you call them a surveyor, to come up, and I didn't tell him why, but I said he better put a white post every 100 feet. He probably thought we were going to divide it into lots or something, but anyway, he put 5 white posts. And where the 5th white post, we started to look for the location. And we found that that was the highest point, and it had the greatest view, and yet it was all covered up with bushes, and we couldn't find it, you see. And then we could move back and forth where the house would be, but we found the most perfect place to have Baba's own room in the house at that 500 point.
However, in 1947, as these plans began to take shape, Baba called Elizabeth and Norina back to India.
I have to say that during the time that this all was being done, Norina and I went back to India for almost 2 years, so that we were not constantly here. We were always very fortunate to find reliable people that were interested in what they were doing and knew more than we did about building, but they did a very good job.
Among those reliable people that Elizabeth mentions were the builder Truman Moore, George Anderson, who was involved in road construction on the center, Mr. LeBruce, the landscaper who had suggested weaving the fence around the trees, and many others. In preparation for their trip to India, Elizabeth and Norina arranged for the Shaw family to oversee the work on the center. Darwin's mother and father, Aaron and Helen Shaw, came down to Myrtle Beach first and lived at Yukon Dunes for 1 year, followed by Darwin and Jean and their 3 children. While Darwin was here, one of his main projects was working on draining the swamps and small ponds that covered some areas of the center.
When we stayed here for a year, I took a year's leave of absence from my job in 1947, 48, was it 48, I guess it was. And we moved down here with our family. And my parents had been here before that. And there used to be a big swamp over near the main highway. And this was one of the big projects, to have a drainage ditch running down through that great swamp the whole length of the property in order to alleviate the mosquito problem. That was really a big project.
Darwin worked some on the project during vacations, and then extensively when he and Jean moved to Myrtle Beach in 1948. Working closely with him was a local civil engineer, Mr. Nicholas Hughes. In his book, Darwin describes the work in some detail. The drainage project, undertaken to get rid of the mosquitoes, proved to be complicated and time-consuming. The project involved exploring the center woodlands where large ponds of water were trapped due to poor drainage. In addition to the largest swamp area, which flowed into the center from Highway 17 near the old North Road and extended across almost the entire width of the center property, there were also scattered swamp areas and low places where water accumulated. While my father was working at the center, he and Frank Eaton did some work on trying to drain the low areas near Highway 17. During vacation periods, I had also spent time exploring the swamplands as well as the many low areas throughout the center property to determine the extent of the problem. Clearly, the best solution was to drain the large swamp. Reports were continuously sent to Elizabeth and Baba in India, including a map showing the areas to be dealt with and, over a period of time, several different drainage plans. Each plan was thoroughly investigated and in turn superseded by a more expensive but better plan. Finally, Baba accepted what proved to be the best plan. In May of 1948, Elizabeth had to return to America for 2 months to renew her visa and see to some business concerns. One of these involved the transfer of the Myrtle Beach property into Meher Baba's name. This she accomplished on June 9, 1948. It must have been evident to Elizabeth and Norina and to all of the other disciples living and working with Meher Baba in India that something significant was to happen in 1949. On January 1st, Meher Baba issued an important circular spelling out new restrictions. Throughout the year, he made cryptic remarks regarding the gravity of what the coming months would hold. That summer, Baba entered into a period of seclusion that lasted for 40 days. This seclusion, which came to be known as his Great Seclusion, ended on August 1st, 1949. On the very next day, Elizabeth and Norina were sent back to America to complete their work of developing the Meher Spiritual Center. Before they departed, Baba entered into an agreement with Elizabeth. He told her that he would agree to come to America for 1 year if she was able to pay for all of the expenses of Baba and his party for the duration of his stay. In addition, Elizabeth would have to complete the construction of his house on the Meher Spiritual Center property so that he could stay there when he visited the center. When Elizabeth and Norina returned from India on August 2nd, 1949, they had no idea that Meher Baba was about to embark on one of the most significant periods of his life's work, the new life. He and a group of devotees were to travel around India incognito and live as traveling pilgrims, begging for their food. He told all of his devotees around the world that they must be resigned to never see him again, while at the same time exacting a promise from Elizabeth to prepare for his visit to the U.S. to inaugurate the spiritual center that they were still in the process of building. It seems their first inkling of this new phase of Meher Baba's work came in a cable from Baba on August 9th, 1949, in which he says, Now take July as final. Stop. On my side, July is definite and must be made definite on your side. Stop. Am disposing of everything here and positively entering new life of absolute renunciation from 16th October. Stop. Will soon post you details of this new phase with instructions. Baba sent a detailed letter to Elizabeth and Norina, to whom he gave the joint nickname Norina, affirming his intention to come to America for 1 year, provided the necessary preparations have been accomplished. He writes, I want you both to understand very clearly that this new life of mine will be carried on till the very end. But I also want you both to be sure that my coming to America for 1 year will not come in the way of the fulfillment of the conditions and the oath regarding the new life. Therefore, take it as an absolute certainty that my decision about my coming to America for 1 year in July 1950 stands good. In addition to many important details regarding the development of the Meher Spiritual Center, he goes on to say that Elizabeth and Norina have special permission to communicate with him. I am leaving Pimplegown and Mehrabad on the 16th of October, and no one in the East or West can write or wire to me. But because of me coming, plans and arrangements, I give you two the freedom after 16th of October to cable me whenever necessary, only regarding this coming of mine, and to definitely wire me in June 1950. I hope it is all clear to you both. Acknowledge this by cabling me immediately to the usual address before 15th of October. In closing, he mentions the Meher Spiritual Center drainage project that Darwin and Aaron Shaw had worked on over the 2 previous years, and to which Baba had devoted a great deal of attention. He says, I am very happy that the drainage project and clearing and ditching has been taken in hand. My eternal love to you both, Baba. Elizabeth received another letter from Baba a few days later, on September 21st, 1949. Baba wrote, Dear Elizabeth, I want you to specially note that yours will be the only will that will remain intact and which I will keep with me. Also, that although no property will remain in my name, Myrtle Beach will always remain in my name and be the only property belonging to me. He closes saying, All my love to you and Norina, Baba. Apparently, Norina was concerned that she and Elizabeth had not received specific instructions regarding their participation in the new life, and had communicated these concerns to Baba. He replied in a cable sent via Elizabeth, If you had read New Life details clearly, you would have understood the conditions are given personally to only those accompanying me. Stop. Norina will be participating by following all cables and letters sent up to date. Stop. Elizabeth definite adherence to all agreements helped by Norina for present and for future is ample participation. Love Norina, Baba. Less than a week later, Elizabeth received another cable from Baba. It read, Cable received, stop. Noted about business prospects, stop. Am starting for new life day after tomorrow. Stop. Deepest love, Norina, Baba. Before departing on his new life travels, Meher Baba had said to his Indian devotees, Nothing is to remain as my property and in my name excepting the Marabad Hill premises, on which the tomb for my bodily remains has already been built by me, and you all should always remember that when I leave my body, it is to be buried here. Even so, the Meher Spiritual Center also remained in Baba's name throughout the New Life period. It remained so until 1958, when the property was returned to Elizabeth Patterson to be administered under her stewardship as a place of world pilgrimage. During these New Life travels, Baba and his party traveled throughout India, often on foot, subsisting on whatever was offered to them by strangers as they passed through different regions. Meanwhile, Elizabeth struggled to complete the necessary preparations in anticipation of Baba's visit to America. After many months of work and communication back and forth, in September of 1951, Elizabeth wrote to Baba confirming that all of his conditions had been met and hoping that he would come to Myrtle Beach soon. Baba replied, "Absolutely happy, Norina successful, having Baba definitely come to America about end of March, God willing. Deepest love, Baba." He then sent this message: "The necessary arrangements having been successfully completed by Elizabeth and Norina, I shall, if God so wills it, and if I am alive, come to the West next year. I have therefore decided to leave India for the West at the end of March or during the first week of April 1952, and I shall fly directly to America. Later in the year, I shall stay a few weeks, England, France, and Switzerland. In order that the results of my work from October 16, 1951 to February 1952 may be fully manifested in the Western world, either with the fullest success or as an utter failure, I must be in seclusion for the first 2 weeks of my stay in America. I therefore want no publicity of any kind, either when I leave India or when I arrive in America. And for these first 2 weeks following my arrival in America, only a very few of my most intimate Eastern and Western disciples will be staying with me. After these first 2 weeks of seclusion, I shall see everyone everywhere, because eventually I shall have to give to the world the results of my 4 months' work." After sending this message to the West, Meher Baba began a period of special work that he called his Monanash work on 16th October 1951. This work concluded in mid-February 1952 and marked the end of his New Life period. The following 2 months would be the only rest that Meher Baba would allow himself before traveling to Myrtle Beach. But travel to Myrtle Beach he did, finally arriving at the Meher Spiritual Center on April 21st, 1952. Upon arrival at his house on the center, he said, "I am so happy to be here, and most of all, I am deeply touched with the love and devotion shown by both Elizabeth and Norina throughout the past years in preparing such a unique spot for my work and comfort. No detail, no expense has been spared to carry out my wishes, and all as a labor of love, love direct from the heart. And as such, I accept the gift. I have had many homes this time. I have laid my head on the ground, in palaces, and on concrete floors of humble homes. But of all the homes I have visited, This is the home that I love the best, because it was given to me and built for me with such love. And then he said, I never leave. Remember, I do not leave, because this is my home. Although he spent the first 2 weeks in seclusion, Baba met many old and new devotees during his stay on the center. Among these were Darwin Shaw and his family. Jean Shaw recorded in her diary, pointing to Darwin and me, he said, every inch of the center is full of their love, Norina, Elizabeth, and the Shaws. Also among the early visitors were Ivy Deuce and her daughter. Elizabeth and Norina had arrived in India in July of 1947. Only a few weeks later, in August, the dear friend that they had made in San Francisco, Rabia Martin, passed away. Before she died, Rabia passed the shepherding of the Sufi order to her friend and murid, Ivy Deuce. She had encouraged Ivy to seek out Meher Baba and accept his guidance for the Sufi order. Ivy did just that and arrived at Meherazad in January of 1948, while Elizabeth and Norina were there. Ivy was concerned that she was not spiritually advanced. Baba liked her honesty and agreed to help her. He said to her, by not taking upon the responsibility of posing as a God-realized leader, and by working as my medium, the devotion of hundreds will flow towards me, and you will have no responsibility. Ivy replied, I wholeheartedly accept what you wish me to do. While staying at Yupon Dunes in July of 1952, Baba directed Adi K. Irani to write to Ivy, and he described to her the relationship between Sufism and the Meher Spiritual Center. Adi wrote, Baba wants you to know that Sufism reoriented American Center has no direct connection with the Meher Center on the Lakes, Myrtle Beach. Meher Center on the Lakes is not a Sufi, Vedantic, Buddhist, Christian, or Zoroastrian center. It is the Baba Center, based on universality. This Baba Center will have within it 4 different centers of devotion, service, renunciation, and knowledge. When delivering her talk in Mandla in 1939, mentioned earlier, Norina Matchabelli described the oft-repeated ideas that Baba's center should include a spiritual academy, a house of advanced souls, an abode for saints, a hospital for the mad, and a resting place for the afflicted. Dolores Shaw, Darwin's niece, who had lived with Norina for a time in New York, even incorporated these ideas into a map that she composed in the 1940s. However, no evidence has been uncovered that Meher Baba was committed to including such ideas in the design of the Meher Spiritual Center, and so Elizabeth never pursued them, and Baba never asked about them. For Elizabeth and all of those who had labored so hard in preparation, only one thing mattered. He came.
And when Baba came to America in 1952, this was his first visit to the center. And on that occasion, Kitty Davy, our dear Kitty Davy, came over with Baba and has remained here as a stalwart, faithful, and very energetic Baba lover and servant here ever since, serving Baba's cause here ever since, together with Elizabeth. And they have made a wonderful team, and Baba knew who he was picking out to bring together to work this center. But of course, he has been all over this center, and I know probably for the new people who come here, when you walk around the center, you feel Baba's presence and the wonderful atmosphere here, and you probably wonder just where Baba did this and where he did that. But for the old-timers who were here when Baba was here, and many of the new-timers too, because that wasn't so long ago, when we walk around the center, we don't see vacant places between the trees. We see Baba walking between the trees. We see him sitting here. We see him embracing someone there. And we see him almost everywhere we go. Everything is a constant reminder. Ah, yes, he sat there, and we all gathered around and sat with him for a while. He put on Ben Heyman's hat funny for a while. Things like that. And up by Baba's house, he sat on the ground by this tree, and someone had made a big garland of seashells for Baba and painted them different colors, and they represented the 7 plains. And Baba sat there, and we all gathered around. But this is the way it goes with us here, that we can't help remembering him everywhere we go, in the barn, being there with him, in the lagoon cabin, the precious moments when we were there with him, and here and there on the grounds when we had the good fortune to just coincidentally be there when he was there and receive a lovely embrace from him. So this center has gone through quite a long evolution in developing to where it is now.
But of course, I can put it this way. The center was a beautiful place of nature before Baba came. But after he came, it has a plus quality that's indescribable. It is spiritual, but it's something that even if you know nothing, you feel something is very beautiful in regard to the center. And Baba once said, "I never leave." And we feel that he is always here and directs, not in any supernatural way, but in a perfectly natural way. Things happen or they don't happen. And we know it's what Baba wants or doesn't want. Baba has said several times that this center was his home. He said he's never been any place that he's felt more at home than in India, than here. Because it was all built, of course, with one purpose, for Baba and with love. And so he said it was his home in the West. He's also said that in time to come, it would be a great place of pilgrimage. I cannot say what that would be, but I know it's gradually more and more people are coming. And I cannot say 100 years from now, but it will remain a place of pilgrimage, where people will want to come. Not necessarily have to stay on the center, but will come because he was here.